When I was 4 years old, my mom and I moved into a large colonial house that was built in the late 1800s. My mom always had a weird feeling about the house. There was this little bricked off section in the basement, and we never knew why it was there. My mother told me that soon after we moved into the house, I suddenly had an imaginary friend. One day, out of the blue, I told her that I had been playing with a little girl named Jenny. She thought that it was just a phase and didn't pay much attention to it. I told her that Jenny wanted me to let the cat go into the basement so that she could play with it. My mother allowed me to let the cat go down there. It never came back. That creeped her out. Then, a few days later, I told her Jenny wanted me to go down in the basement to play with her. My mother refused and told me to go upstairs to bed. I did, and when I woke up the next morning, I had deep scratches on my back and legs. My mom decided to research the history of the house. She found an old picture of the house and the family who used to live there. She showed me the picture and asked if I recognized any of them. There were 7 little girls in the picture, and, without hesitation, I pointed to one of them. The name of all the family members were written on the back. The girl I had pointed to was named Jenny. My mother got scared because during her research, she had discovered that the girl named Jenny had gone down into the basement one day and was never seen again. The family never found her and they moved shortly after that. After I identified the girl in the picture, it was all way too much for my mom to handle. We moved out of the house and found somewhere else to live. When I was 18, my mom told me about what had happened in that house. It still scares me to think about it. When I was younger, my niece had an imaginary friend, but she said she wasn't allowed to tell anyone his name. She said he told her everyone would get scared if they knew it. But we kept asking her, and she would never tell anyone the name. Then one day, her mom and I were in the hallway, and my niece didn't realize it. She was talking to her imaginary friend and called him by his name. To this day, whenever I think about it, I'm still creeped out. The imaginary's friend was Lucifer. I was staying in my aunt's house when I saw my 4-year-old cousin April sitting on the stairs. She was making funny faces. I asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Well, I'm copying the lady with the braid." But there was no one else there, so I asked, "Well, where is this lady, April?" She pointed up at a beam running parallel to the stairwell. "And what's this lady doing?" I asked. "Well, she's making funny faces," April replied. I was about to go upstairs when April said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Her braid, it's around her neck." I asked what she meant. April pointed up and said, "The lady is hanging by her braid. She's making funny faces at me." Then April started making a face. Her eyes were wide and bugged out. Her mouth hung open and her tongue stuck out. I realized it was the face of someone who was being strangled to death. When I was growing up, there was a girl in my neighborhood that was very, very strange. All of the other kids were freaked out by her. One day, she told all of the kids that in the forest behind her house, there was dead, bloody people. When they heard this, all the kids freaked out and told their parents. Their fathers had to go out and search the forest just in case. But all they found was candy wrappers and empty beer bottles. After that, all the kids in my neighborhood refused to go near her, including me. A few years later, my parents divorced. On the day the moving came to take my mom's things out of the house, the girl came up to me out of nowhere and told me that Matt didn't like that my parents were getting a divorce. I had no idea who Matt was. Even though I stopped being friends with her, my dad was still friends with her parents. My dad had told me that Matt was her imaginary friend. Her parents had told him all about the problems they were having. Matt was often too physical. They claimed that Matt could control the lights and could even make the power go out. They said Matt also knocked on doors at night, and if he was ignored, the banging on the doors would start. A few years later, my dad decided that he would invite the girl and her parents over to our house. I was begging my dad not to do this, but he said it would be nice to catch up with them. So when they came over that night, my dad told me to entertain the girl. I brought her up to my bedroom, and she seemed to be acting normal. She even told me how nice my room was. However, I was still creeped out by her. She just sat down in the middle of the floor while I tried to put a movie on the DVD player. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, in the most deadpan voice, she said, "Matt's here." And at that exact moment, the lights began to flicker on and off. I got so scared I ran out of my room, crying in fear. Her parents came running up the stairs, dragged their daughter out of my room, and took her home. For weeks afterwards, I refused to sleep in my bedroom. I haven't heard much from that family ever since then. But I have heard that Matt still controlled the lights, but I didn't know if he was really still around. To this day, whenever the lights begin to flicker or a bulb blows, it still freaks me out. My girlfriend is a homicide detective, and a couple years ago, she was investigating the murder of a little boy. They still hadn't found the body. One day, the mother of the little boy broke down and admitted that she had killed him and hid his body under their old trailer. When the police went out to search the trailer, they found that there was a new family living in it. The family said their son had an imaginary friend who also lived under the trailer and would come up and to see him. The cops went under the trailer and they found the body of the dead boy just under his room. When my daughter was 3, she had an imaginary friend named Kelly who lived in her closet. She said Kelly played with her and sat in a little rocking chair while she slept. 2 years later, we were watching a horror movie and my daughter said, "That looks like Kelly." "Kelly who?" I asked. "You know Kelly," she replied. "That's the dead girl that lives in my closet." When I was a kid, we often went camping on Lake Superior, located in Thunder Bay, Ontario. One day, when I was 6 years old, I fell off the dock and plunged into the water. I still couldn't swim. While I was under the water, I distinctly remember seeing a little girl down there who told me to look up towards the sun and just keep kicking and I'd be fine. I swam to the surface just in time for my grandfather to grab me and pull me back on the dock. I found out later that a little girl had drowned in that lake near that very same spot. When I was just a baby, my older sister Julia had an imaginary friend named Jessica. She said when Jessica got mad, her eyes turned green and her voice grew deeper. She was Julia's friend for a long, long time. But then things started to get a little weird. After a while, my parents began to believe that our house was haunted. One night, my mom was putting me to bed and I began to cry and point at the corner. My mom tried to comfort me, but I kept crying and pointing at the same corner. All of a sudden, my sister walked into the room, pointed at the corner and yelled, "Jessica, stop it!" I immediately stopped crying and Julia said, "Sometimes Jessica likes to put on scary masks and scare people." My mom was a little freaked out and said, "Well, tell Jessica that if she can't play nice, she can't play here at all." Eventually, my sister Julia outgrew her imaginary friend and stopped mentioning her. A few years later, my little sister Abby began to talk. She told my mom that she had a friend that no one else could see. She said her imaginary friend's eyes turned green when she was upset, and her voice got a little bit deeper. My mother asked her what her imaginary friend's name was, and she replied, "Jessica." One night when we were watching a scary movie, my nephew looked up and said, "What's George doing on TV?" I asked him what he meant, and he said, "That boy on TV looks like George." I asked him who George was, and he replied, "Well, he lives above my bed, and every night when the lights are off, he talks to me, but I can't hear him." So I asked my nephew to draw me a picture of George. So he drew a small boy with black holes for eyes and no teeth who was bleeding from his neck. "That's George," he said. One night I was looking after a 5-year-old boy, and he told me that a man named Jacob, who was dressed like a lumberjack, was sitting next to me on the couch. He must have seen the look of shock on my face and said, "Don't worry, he doesn't have any arms." A friend of mine told me that she was concerned because her son talked about a ghost who would talk to him and play with him in his room. He said the ghost was called the Captain, and he was an old man with a beard. He said the Captain told him when he grows up, his job will be to kill people. And then the Captain would tell him who he would need to kill. The kid would cry, and he said he didn't want to be a killer, but the Captain told him that he didn't have a choice, and he would get used to killing after a while. The boy also told a girl in his class, "I know where you live. And you might be good at hiding, but I'll still find you." My little brother had an imaginary friend named Roger, who lived under our coffee table. He said Roger had a wife and 9 kids. Roger and his family lived peacefully under our coffee table for almost 3 years. Then one day, my little brother announced that Roger wouldn't be around anymore. When we asked him why, he told us that he had shot and killed Roger and his whole family. I don't know if he'll remember any of this today, but his genuine lack of remorse was very, very disturbing. When my mother was young, she had an imaginary friend named Shaggy. When she got a little older, she told her mother that she was finished with Shaggy, so she got rid of him. Well, my grandmother asked her what she meant, and she said, "Well, I chopped him up and I put him in the fridge." When my little brother was little, he acted like he had imaginary friends who he was talking to every second of every day. One day, my mom overheard him saying, "I can't kill him. He's my only dad." When I was little, I had a whole gang of imaginary friends. One day, my mom noticed I hadn't talked about them in a while, and she asked me what happened to them. I calmly told her that they all died in a car crash. When I was younger, my best friend had a little sister who was 5 or 6 years old. She had an imaginary friend named Icy. One day, I was waiting for him to come downstairs when his sister came up to me and said, "Icy told me to ask you if you know when you're going to die." I laughed nervously, but I played along. "Well, no, of course I don't," I said. "No one knows that. Hopefully I won't die until I'm very old." The little girl just looked at me and shook her head sadly and said, "No, Icy wants me to tell you that it'll be tonight." And with that, she just turned and walked away. A good friend of the family asked me to babysit their 6-year-old son. I had put him to bed, and a couple hours later, I decided to peek in to check on him. When I opened the door, I saw he was standing in the corner facing the wall. It was one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. I asked him what he was doing, and all he did was turn around, put his fingers to his lips, and say, "Shh." I asked him again what he was doing, and all he said was, "Leave us. It is the punishment." When I was 3 years old, I had an imaginary friend named Faye. Whenever I drew pictures of her, she never had a face. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. My mom asked me why she didn't have any facial features, and I said, She isn't living anymore, so she's not allowed to have a face.